When I was a sophomore in college, I decided I wanted to learn how to play the guitar. There were two primary reasons why I wanted to do that. The first is that I had just accepted a job as youth pastor, and I had visions of leading songs around campfires. That vision actually came true. It played out, albeit not quite as smooth as I expected or hoped it would. The second reason I wanted to learn to play was because a group of my friends had decided that they were all going to take advantage of a guitar class that was being taught at our university. And I thought it'd be a lot of fun to take that class with them. I can't remember who told me this as I was about to begin the journey of learning how to play the guitar, but I'll never forget what they said. One of the great things about the guitar is that you can pick up the instrument and very quickly, even the first time, the first lesson, learn how to play a simple song. But you can work your entire life on the instrument and never master it. There's always more to learn. If you've ever learned how to play the guitar, you know that of which I speak here. Those words are very true. And in some ways, they're also true about Scripture. You know, it could be the first time you've ever picked up the Bible. And in so doing, if you open its pages, you can read something that could move you and be very, very powerful the very first time you dive into it. But you could study Scripture. You could read the Bible every single day, and there is still always something to be learned. You'll never master it. I was reminded of this recently. I was reading through Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians. Now, I have read 2 Corinthians multiple times. But this time as I was reading the letter, something popped out to me that I just hadn't been thinking about in a while, but when it did, it struck me in an incredibly powerful way. Why did it strike me in a powerful way? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the story that's in this 8th chapter of 2 Corinthians. It's about the churches in Macedonia, this group of ancient churches in Macedonia. And Paul tells the church in Corinth that they were experiencing a tremendous affliction that was causing great suffering and extreme poverty. Now, we don't know what the affliction was. We just know the results of it. So I'm reading that story, one that I've read multiple times before, but the reason it stood out to me this time is because I was reading it as we were just a few months into this experience with COVID. Our country had been shut down, and there were all kinds of economic concerns and health concerns and worries that were spreading across the country, and we were in a period of crisis and affliction. And one of the things that I was most concerned about was the church. I was worried about what all of this would mean for our church, for our members and their well-being, for our ministries of connectivity and worship and outreach and service. I was worried about our budget. As your pastor, I was so concerned about our church, I just didn't know what was going to happen to us. There was no class in seminary on how to pastor through a pandemic or a crisis like this. I had never done so. And I was looking everywhere for guidance and solutions and answers. And there, as I was just reading through 2 Corinthians, I come across this story set in a very different time, in a very different place, about a church and a group of churches who are suffering an affliction, a great crisis that is impacting all of them to the point that it's causing them to experience suffering and even extreme poverty. As I read through that story, it just stopped me cold. I actually read it multiple times in that setting. And I'm so glad it did, because it gave me hope, it gave me faith, and it gave me some concrete instruction for maybe some ways that we could get through this journey. And it reminded me once again, I don't care how many times you've read the Bible, You just keep reading it and keep reading it and keep reading it, because in each different season of your life, it's going to speak to you differently. There is always something to learn in its pages. Over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to talk about this crisis in Macedonia. We're going to talk about what happened to these churches. And more importantly, we're going to talk about their response to that crisis, how they moved through that crisis. And we're going to learn from them spiritually, which is probably the bigger of the two lessons. We're going to learn spiritually what they did, but we're also going to learn some practical things that they did that I think can guide us and instruct us as a church and as individuals. The other thing I'm going to do in this journey is I'm going to couch the conversation through some words that are found in Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. It comes at the end of chapter 13. You may remember chapter 13, Paul talks a lot about love. But at the end of that chapter, Paul talks about the fact that we can never fully understand the mysteries of faith. Again, we can study all of our lives. We will never understand the mysteries of faith. We'll always be looking through a mirror dimly as we seek to understand those things. However, while we'll never fully understand the mysteries of faith, Paul says that there are some things we can count on, specifically 3 things that we can count on that will get us through every season of life: faith, hope, and love. And it's interesting, when you look at the story of the Macedonian church, you see them living in faith, living in hope, and living in love. And if we can follow their examples of living into those 3 things, I think we may find that there is hope in this moment, even joy that can come from this moment. It's not to minimize the suffering. It's not to minimize the crisis. It's to talk about our response to it. We're going to begin the journey by talking about how they lived into faith. And I'm just going to read how the story begins. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means, and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. And this, not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and, by the will of God, to us. All right, let's unpack this just a little bit. First, again, just to reaffirm, here's Paul talking about this affliction, this suffering that they're experiencing, and pointing out that it doesn't just drive them into some poverty, it drives them into extreme poverty. And yet, in the midst of that extreme poverty, the members of the churches in Macedonia didn't retreat into kind of a mode of self-protection and fear. Saying, I got to look out for number one. I got to take care of myself because this is a moment where if I don't do that, I don't know who will. Instead, they did something so faithful, so bold, that they came together and they recognized that they weren't the only ones suffering. They recognized that this suffering was on a scale that it was impacting everyone. And the only way for anyone in the community to get through it was for the entire community to get through it together. So they decide that they're going to step out in faith. They're going to live in faith. And even though they are in a moment of extreme poverty, they gather their resources and they offer a gift to the church, the larger church who's out there trying to respond to this situation. They offer a gift to the larger church that is so large. It's so large that Paul seems to indicate that he tried to tell them, look, this is beyond your means. It's too much. The story tells us that they had to beg him to take the money, to take the gift, because it was so much. Their faith was so extreme and so out there that Paul was like, whoa, pump the brakes a little bit. And they said, no, Paul, we're not having it. We believe, we're living in faith, we're stepping out, we know we can get through this, and this is how we're going to get through this. So they offer this unbelievable gift. They live out their faith by doing it. And then the story is very intentional about telling us that they did it with joy. It filled their hearts and their churches and their families and their communities with joy. They just rejoiced as they offered the gift. Man, talk about faith. You know, I'm committed to a life of faithful stewardship and generosity. It's something that's a part of who I am and have been for a while. But man, there are times that it's not always easy. And there are times when I am certainly not filled with joy as I do it, especially in those moments where it feels like things are unsettled and uncertain. But then I read this story and I see their actions of faith and how it resulted in their joy, and I'm so inspired by it. As I was studying the actions and the faith and the joy and the joyful generosity of the people in Macedonia, I couldn't help but think about a story of joyful, faithful generosity in our own church. When I came to be your pastor just over 18 years ago, I began to notice that every single time two of our church members gave an offertory, those two members being Sonny and Charlotte Tharp, every single time they offered an invitation for people to give to the Lord and give to the ministries of the church, they ended their invitation with the words, "Give with joy." They said it every single time. Every single time. I noticed as the years passed that in that 8:30 service, other people began to give offertory invitations, and they would end with those same words: give with joy. It got to the point where more often than not, people who would lead that moment of offering invitation and giving people the opportunity to give to God, they more often than not, they ended with those three words: give with joy. Now, I've never taken those words for granted. They are not just simple words that people throw out there. These words have deep meaning. And I know they have deep meaning because I know the faith of Sonny and Charlotte, and I know the faith of the others who have shared those words as well. I reached out not long ago to Charlotte and asked her if she would be willing to share with us the story of those three words: give with joy. And why it was that she and Sonny were so faithfully committed to reminding us about the joy in faithful generosity. So we videoed her, and here's the story that she told.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Tharp. Sonny Tharp was my husband for 52 years. We were a part of First Christian Church from 1977-78 until this past year, and are still a very important part of this church, or it is a very important part of us. I wish I had a rather romantic, dramatic story about how Give with Joy came to be. I think more it had to do with my background, Sonny's background, than anything else. We never sat down and discussed finding a phrase that we could use with the prayers. But each of us had grown up in homes where we didn't have a whole lot. And we learned as children and as we grew older that anytime we had money, if it was a few dollars, or if it was time, or if it was groceries from the garden, or whatever, there was a great deal of joy in giving. And so I think that just came with us. And as we began to use that phrase, don't know which of us used it first. It would be a little more glamorous if I could give you the whole story, but I don't know that. But those backgrounds led us to believe that giving brought joy, and that if you gave and gave in the way that we should all give, that joy should always be there. Now, I think a lot of times when we give, we kind of think about the sacrifice and what we're giving up rather than what we're giving toward. And so I would advise all of us as we enter a season of determining how we're going to give for the future, that we begin by thinking about the outcome, not what we're giving up, but for what might happen if we are able to give and if our church is able to do the things that it wants to do. You know, Sonny and I were both brought up in the church. We both knew that we were God's children, as was any other human being. And I think if any of you were a part of Sonny's funeral, you heard Brian talk about how Sonny was such a non-judgmental person. And it was that kind of upbringing that we had. So if we were God's children and everybody else was God's children, then giving to your brothers and sisters ought to be a good thing. That ought to bring you joy. And so that, again, just kind of led into our using that phrase. It was a long time, I guess. I can't remember how long we'd used it. I know we'd used it before Brian joined us 18 years ago. But it just became a part of that early service on Sunday morning especially, and then we began hearing other people use it. Didn't even pay that much attention at the beginning as others used it. But I do know that it is true. If you give with love, if you give to another of God's children, then there's just no way to give without joy. And as you make your decision this year on what you want to give, whether it's going to be dollars or it's going to be vegetables out of the garden, if we all can have a feeling of giving, that our whole lives are here in order for us to give to someone else, to other people, then there is no way that we can give any other way than to give with joy. And I wish that for you.
There are so many things I love about that story and so many things that it teaches me. First among them is the fact that both Sonny and Charlotte grew up without having much. And yet they understood, and they were taught to understand, that no matter how little you have, you're called to give faithfully to the needs of others, whether that comes from your time, your financial resources, or even if it's something from the garden. And what they began to learn as they did that early in life was that when they would step out in faith and give to others, there was this joy that they experienced. They began to move from a place where they saw the giving of things to God and the giving of gifts to others as something they were giving up. They stopped focusing so much about what they were giving up, and they started focusing on what they were giving toward. And as they made that shift, it was a fundamental change in how they viewed generosity and how they viewed giving to others and giving to God, primarily because they understood that we've all been made in God's image and we're all God's children. And so when we help one another, we're helping out a brother and sister who's been made in God's image, a child of God. That is so beautiful. And if you're giving to a brother and sister, how can you not do that with joy? Over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to talk about that kind of joyful, faithful giving. We're going to learn from the Macedonian church and how it impacted them and how it led them through their moment. And we're going to learn how that kind of joy-filled faith can get us through this moment. One of the things we're going to be asking you to do over the course of the next several weeks is, in addition to giving your regular offerings to the church, we're going to ask that you begin the process of thinking about what you're going to estimate your giving to be next year. And you can start filling that out. The form is available today. It's going to be connected to every media source that you could watch or listen to this sermon on. So you can start that process today and fill that out, and we can know. What I'd like to invite you to do, though, is to think about the joy of the moment. Yes, I know that sometimes giving is a sacrifice, but rather than just focusing on what you're giving up, think about what you're giving toward. We're giving toward a communal hope. And by living in faith together, by being in this together, we can get through this better. And maybe even find a way to give with joy. I hope that will be the way I fill out my card this year, and that you fill out yours as well, because it certainly is a blessing to be able to share what we have. Amen.